There is a moment that comes for almost every person who reaches the far side of 60. It doesn't arrive with fireworks. It arrives quietly, usually late at night, when the house is silent and the day's obligations have finally stopped shouting. You lie there and a single question surfaces, one you spent 40 years too busy to ask. Was it worth it? Not the job, not the mortgage, not the promotions or the vacations or the retirement account you checked every quarter with a mixture of hope and dread. The question is bigger than that. It's whether the way you spent your one and only life actually matches the person you meant to become. Most people never ask this question until it's almost too late to answer it. But there was one group of men, 2,000 years ago, who built their entire philosophy around asking it early, asking it often, and answering it honestly. They were the Stoics, and strangely enough, the wisdom they left behind was never really written for the young. It was written for the old. It was written for men and women standing exactly where you may be standing right now, at the threshold between a life of striving and a life of meaning. This is not a video about maximizing your 401k, and it's not another list of vague platitudes about enjoying your golden years. This is about 10 hard, practical, sometimes uncomfortable rules the Stoics left behind for exactly this stage of life. Rules that, if you apply them, will let you walk into your last decades without the quiet, gnawing regrets so many people carry into their final years. Stay until the end, because rule number 7 is the one almost nobody talks about, and it might be the most important one on this entire list. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the place where ancient philosophy meets modern life, where the words of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus stop being dusty quotes in a textbook and start becoming tools you can actually use. If you're new here, we take the oldest, most battle-tested ideas about how to live well and translate them into something you can apply today, this week, this decade. If that sounds like something you need, consider subscribing and joining thousands of others who are learning to build an inner fortress no circumstance can shake. Now, let's talk about what it actually means to retire without regret. Seneca once wrote a letter to his friend Paulinus called On the Shortness of Life. In it, he made an observation so sharp it still stings today. He said that it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. Most of life, he said, is spent not living, but merely preparing to live. Think about that for a moment in the context of your own story. How many years did you spend preparing? Preparing for the promotion, preparing for the kids to grow up, preparing for the house to be paid off, preparing for retirement itself, that mythical finish line where finally, you would begin to actually live. And now here you are, or here you soon will be. The preparation is over. The finish line you worked toward for 4 decades is no longer a fantasy. It's your actual life, starting now. And this is precisely the moment where so many people, having spent their entire existence chasing a future date, don't know what to do when that date finally arrives. This is the danger zone. Studies on retirement transition consistently show a spike in depression, a loss of identity, and even earlier mortality in men and women who retire without a plan for meaning, not a plan for money, a plan for meaning. The Stoics saw this coming 20 centuries before modern psychology gave it a name. They understood that a life well lived isn't measured by how long you accumulate, but by how well you spend what remains. And they built an entire framework for exactly this final act of the play. So let's walk through it together. 10 rules. Ancient in origin, urgent in relevance. Consider this less of a lecture and more of a conversation with 3 old friends, Marcus, Seneca, and Epictetus, who have quite a lot to say about how you spend the years you have left. Before we go further, I want you to do something small. Drop a comment below telling me how old you are, or how many years you have until retirement. I read every single one, and I promise you, by the end of this video, you'll want to look back at what you wrote. Rule 1. Memento mori. Remember you will die, so you finally live. There's an old story, likely embellished over the centuries, but powerful nonetheless. about Roman generals returning to the city after a great military victory. As they rode through the streets in a triumphant parade, crowds cheering, flowers thrown at their feet, a slave would stand behind the general in his chariot, holding a laurel crown above the general's head. And the slave had one job, to whisper into the general's ear, again and again, a single phrase, Memento mori, remember you will die. At the very peak of glory, in the middle of the loudest applause a Roman citizen could ever receive, someone was required to remind him of his own mortality, not to depress him, not to ruin the moment, but to keep him honest, to prevent the intoxication of success from convincing him he was something more than human. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, carried this same idea with him every single day, scrawling in his private journal, the collection we now call Meditations, reminders to himself that he could leave this life right now, and that this fact should shape how he decided to act, not with dread, but with clarity, and yes, with urgency. Here's why this matters more at 65 than it did at 25. When you're young, death is an abstraction, something that happens to other people in other decades, in some hazy future you don't need to think about yet. But somewhere around 60, the math starts to change. You've likely lost a parent, maybe a sibling, maybe a close friend from college, or a colleague you worked beside for 30 years. Death stops being a philosophical concept and starts being a guest who has already visited your address more than once. Most people respond to this by looking away. They fill their calendars, their televisions, their scrolling thumbs with anything that keeps the thought at bay. But the Stoics would tell you this is exactly backwards. The awareness of death, held close rather than pushed away, is not the enemy of a good retirement. It is the engine of one. Because here's what happens when you actually sit with your mortality instead of avoiding it. The trivial falls away almost instantly. That argument with your neighbor about the fence line. Suddenly it seems absurd to spend precious mental energy on it. The grudge you've held against your brother for 11 years over something said at a family dinner, it starts to look exactly as small as it actually is. And the things that matter, actually calling your daughter instead of texting her, actually visiting the ocean you've talked about seeing for 30 years, actually telling your spouse what they've meant to you, those things stop being someday items and become today items. I want you to try something right now before you keep watching. Ask yourself honestly, if you knew you had 5 years left, healthy years, but only 5, what would you stop doing tomorrow morning? And what would you finally start? Sit with that question. Don't rush past it. This is not morbid. This is the single most clarifying question you can ask yourself at this stage of life, and the Stoics knew it 2,000 years before. Modern hospice workers confirmed it by listening to the regrets of the dying. Seneca put it plainly, you act like mortals in all that you fear, and like immortals in all that you desire. Most retirees fear death like it's coming next Tuesday, yet plan their weeks like they have 300 more years to get around to what actually matters. Flip that. Fear the wasted week more than you fear the ending. That's rule 1. Rule 2. The dichotomy of control. Let go of what was never yours. Epictetus was born a slave in the Roman Empire, crippled by some accounts, from either birth or brutal mistreatment by an early master. He eventually gained his freedom and became one of the most influential philosophy teachers in the ancient world, and the very first lesson in his surviving teachings, the Enchiridion, is this: some things are within our control and some are not. Our opinions, our impulses, our desires, our aversions, and in short, everything that is our own doing. These are within our control. Our bodies, our reputations, our possessions, and crucially, other people's actions and opinions. These are not within our control. This single distinction, simple as it sounds, is perhaps the most powerful mental tool a human being has ever devised for reducing suffering. And nowhere does it matter more than in the specific griefs of retirement age. Let's be honest about what actually keeps people up at night after 60. It's rarely the big dramatic disasters. It's the slow, grinding frustrations. Your adult son who won't call as often as you'd like. Your body, which used to do what you asked without complaint and now creaks and aches in ways that feel like a personal betrayal. Your investment portfolio, dipping and rising with a market you have zero influence over. Your spouse's health, your friend's health, the political direction of a country you've watched change in ways you don't always recognize. Here is the brutal, liberating Stoic truth. Almost none of that is yours to control. Not your son's phone habits, not the stock market, not how quickly your knees deteriorate, not whether your grandchildren choose to visit on Thanksgiving or spend it with the other side of the family instead. What is yours? Your judgment about these things, your response to them, your choice of what to do with the time and energy you still have. I think of a man I'll call Robert, not his real name, but a composite of a story countless viewers of this channel have shared with us over the years. Robert spent the first 18 months of retirement furious at his former company for not calling him back for consulting work he assumed they'd want, furious at his kids for not visiting enough, furious at his own body for the arthritis that kept him off the golf course 3 days a week instead of 5. He spent 18 months of his precious, finite retirement in a low simmer of resentment about things he had absolutely no power to change. It wasn't until his wife, half in exasperation and half in love, handed him a battered paperback copy of Epictetus that something shifted. He read the line about the dichotomy of control on a Tuesday afternoon, and according to what he later told us, something in his chest actually loosened, like a knot untying after years of being pulled tight. He couldn't control whether his old company called. He could control whether he reached out to build something new. He couldn't control his son's schedule. He could control the quality and warmth of the calls he made himself. Without demand, without resentment. He couldn't control his knees. He could control whether he did the physical therapy exercises the doctor gave him 8 months ago and had been ignoring out of stubborn frustration. Within a year, Robert wasn't a different man exactly. He was the same man, but unclenched. That's the phrase his wife used, unclenched. This is your practice for Rule 2. Take one recurring frustration from your own life, right now something you find yourself complaining about on a weekly basis, and run it through the Stoic filter. Is this actually within my control? If yes, act. If no, and this is the harder part, release your grip on it entirely. Not with bitterness, not with resignation, with the calm understanding that gripping tighter on something you cannot move only exhausts the one resource you actually have left in abundance at this stage of life, your peace of mind. If this idea is resonating with you, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who need to hear this exact message, and it costs you nothing but a second of your time. Rule 3. Amor fati. Love the hand you've been dealt, including this one. There's a difference between accepting your fate and loving it. Acceptance is gritting your teeth. Amor fati, a phrase later popularized by Nietzsche, but deeply rooted in Stoic thought, especially in Marcus Aurelius's writings, is something entirely different. It's an active embrace. It's looking at the totality of your circumstances, including the ones you didn't choose and wouldn't have chosen, and saying, yes, this too belongs to the story of my life, and I will not spend my remaining years fighting the fact that it happened. This rule matters enormously at 60 plus, because by this age, almost everyone is carrying something they didn't choose. Maybe it's a marriage that ended in divorce decades ago and left scars that never fully closed. Maybe it's a career that didn't unfold the way you dreamed it would when you were 22 and full of plans. Maybe it's a health diagnosis that arrived uninvited and rearranged your entire vision of what these years were supposed to look like. Maybe it's simply the quiet grief of realizing you're retiring with less money than you'd hoped, in a smaller home than you'd imagined, further from the life you once pictured for yourself. Marcus Aurelius, ruling an empire beset by plague, war, and the betrayal of people he trusted, wrote to himself, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This is not passive resignation. This is a radical reframe. The obstacle is not separate from your path. The obstacle, fully faced and fully accepted, becomes the path itself. Consider a woman I'll call Diane, a long-time viewer who wrote to us describing her retirement at 62, 3 years earlier than planned, after her company eliminated her position in a restructuring she never saw coming. For the first year, she described her retirement as something that happened to her, a sentence handed down rather than a chapter she was writing. She resented every morning she woke up without the structure of a job she'd held for 26 years. She felt cheated, betrayed, unfinished. The shift, she told us, came when she stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and started asking a different question entirely. Given that this happened, what can I build now that I couldn't have built if I'd stayed? That single reframing, not denying the loss, not pretending the layoff didn't hurt, but refusing to let the unwanted circumstance define the rest of her story, led her, within 18 months, to start a small pottery studio she'd dreamed about since her 30s, but never had the time to pursue while working full-time. She told us, and I remember this phrase distinctly because it captures the entire spirit of Amor, fati, "I didn't get the retirement I planned. I got the one I needed." This doesn't mean pretending hardship is secretly wonderful. The Stoics were not naive optimists insisting everything happens for a beautiful reason. They were realists who understood a simpler truth. The event itself is neutral until your judgment assigns it meaning, and you have far more say over that meaning than you've been led to believe. You cannot rewrite the chapters already written, but you absolutely control the tone of every chapter still to come. So here's your challenge for Rule 3. Name, honestly, the one circumstance in your life you've spent the most energy. Resenting the divorce, the diagnosis, the financial shortfall, the career that ended before you were ready. And instead of asking why it happened, ask what it makes newly possible now that wasn't possible before. Write the answer down. You may be surprised by what surfaces. Rule 4. The view from above. Shrink your problems by expanding your view. Marcus Aurelius had a favorite mental exercise, one modern scholars now call the view from above. He would imagine rising above his own circumstances, above Rome, above the empire, above the entire spinning earth, and looking down at his life as one tiny, fleeting thread in an almost incomprehensibly vast tapestry of human history. From that height, the emperor's anxieties, even the massive ones involving plague and war and betrayal, shrank down to something manageable, not meaningless, manageable. At 60 plus, this exercise takes on a new and specific power, because this is often the age where problems feel enormous precisely because your world has, for many people, contracted. The daily structure of work that once absorbed 8 or 10 hours a day is gone. The community of colleagues you saw every day has scattered. And into that newly spacious silence, small problems can expand to fill the entire room. A disagreement with an adult child can feel like a crisis. A minor health scare can spiral into weeks of anxious rumination. A single argument with your spouse of 40 years can feel, in the moment, unbearably large. The view from above is the antidote to this magnification. Try it literally right now as an exercise. Picture your house from the sky, then your town, then your state, then the curve of the earth itself, then the solar system, and finally the almost unfathomable scale of the galaxy. 100 billion stars, of which our sun is only one, undistinguished and small. Now come back down. Look at the argument you had this morning from that height. Does it still feel as enormous? This isn't meant to diminish your feelings. The Stoics were not asking you to become cold or indifferent to your own life. They were asking you to gain proportion, because unproportioned suffering, treating a minor grievance with the emotional weight of a genuine catastrophe, is one of the most exhausting and unnecessary burdens a person can carry into their later years. years that are, by definition, more limited than the ones behind you. There's a related practice worth mentioning here. Thinking not just spatially but temporally, ask yourself, will this matter in 5 years? Will it matter in 1 year? Will it matter next month? Astonishingly often, the honest answer is no, it will not. And once you know that, you can choose consciously to withhold the emotional investment that problem doesn't actually deserve. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What's one thing that felt enormous at the time, but when you look back now, seems almost laughably small? Share it below. I promise you, someone reading the comments today needs to hear that their current crisis might look exactly the same way in 10 years. Rule 5. Virtue over validation. Stop performing a life for an audience that isn't watching. For most of your working life, you were, in some sense, performing. Not necessarily dishonestly, but performing nonetheless for your boss, for your clients, for your professional reputation, for the neighbors who noticed which car was in your driveway and which schools your children attended. Decades of subtle audience awareness, shaping decisions, not purely from internal values, but from an awareness of how those decisions would be perceived. Retirement, if you let it, offers something rare, the chance to finally stop performing. The Stoics called the highest good virtue, not in the narrow, moralistic sense we sometimes associate with that word today, but in the broader sense of arete, excellence of character, living in accordance with reason and your own deepest values regardless of who's watching or what they'll think. Epictetus made a sharp distinction between what he called things up to us and things not up to us, and he placed other people's opinions of you firmly in the second category. Yet how many retirees spend their newfound freedom still chasing exactly that, the approval of relatives, the admiration of former colleagues, the status signals of a nicer car or a bigger house, even after the career that justified those signals has ended? Seneca wrote something remarkably modern-sounding for a man who died in the year 65. He warned against living according to the opinion of others, rather than according to nature, meaning according to your own genuine examined values. Consider the retiree who spends thousands maintaining a lifestyle designed to impress people he no longer even sees regularly, simply out of habit, out of 40 years of unconscious performance. Compare that to the retiree, and I've heard from several of you in this exact position, who uses these years to finally ask honestly, for the first time perhaps since childhood, what do I actually want, stripped of anyone else's gaze? One woman wrote to us describing how, at 67, she finally stopped attending a monthly social club she'd belonged to for over a decade, a group she'd long since realized she didn't enjoy but kept attending because leaving felt like it would disappoint the other members. It took her, in her words, an embarrassingly long time to realize that no one else was thinking about my attendance nearly as much as I was. She reallocated those Tuesday afternoons to volunteering at a literacy program, something she said gave her more genuine joy in 3 months than the social club had given her in 10 years. This rule asks something uncomfortable of you, an honest audit. Which of your current activities, relationships, and habits are genuinely yours, chosen because they reflect what you actually value, and which are simply performances you've continued out of inertia, waiting for permission you don't actually need to stop? You don't need anyone's permission. You are 60, 65, 70 years old. If there was ever a time in your life to finally live according to your own compass rather than an audience that, frankly, is far too busy with their own lives to be watching yours as closely as you imagine, that time is now. Rule 6. The discipline of desire. Want less and watch how much you already have. The Stoics divided their practical philosophy into what's sometimes called 3 disciplines: the discipline of assent, governing what you believe; the discipline of action, governing what you do; and the discipline of desire, governing what you want and fear. This third discipline deserves special attention here, because retirement, for many people, is precisely when the discipline of desire is tested most severely. Here's why. For decades, desire had a clear, sanctioned outlet: the next promotion, the next raise, the next house, the bigger car, the better vacation. Capitalism and career both provide an endless staircase of desirable next things, and climbing that staircase gave shape and direction to enormous portions of your adult life. Then retirement arrives, and the staircase quite abruptly disappears. There's no next promotion. There's no annual review promising more. And into that vacuum, many retirees simply invent new staircases, bigger boats, more elaborate vacations, home renovation projects that never truly satisfy, an endless hunt for the next acquisition that will finally deliver the contentment the last one somehow didn't. Epictetus offers a piece of advice here that sounds almost too simple to be profound, but sit with it. Wealth consists not in having great possessions, but in having few wants. He wasn't arguing for poverty or deprivation. He was making a psychological observation that modern research on hedonic adaptation has since confirmed almost exactly. Acquiring more things provides only a brief spike of satisfaction before your baseline expectation simply rises to match it, leaving you exactly as unsatisfied as before, just with a bigger boat payment. The discipline of desire asks you to interrupt that cycle deliberately, not by wanting nothing. The Stoics were not ascetics, demanding you renounce all pleasure, but by examining each desire honestly before you chase it. Is this something I genuinely need for a good life? Or is this simply the staircase climbing habit reasserting itself now that the original staircase is gone? There's a particular exercise the Stoics practiced called negative visualization, or premeditatio malorum, imagining the loss of what you have in order to appreciate it more fully right now. Seneca recommended imagining, briefly and without dwelling on it morbidly, that you might lose your health, your home, your spouse. Not to induce anxiety, but to shock yourself out of the numbness that familiarity breeds, and to return your attention to how much you actually already possess. Try this right now. Look around the room you're sitting in, the roof over your head. If you're fortunate enough to have your health, or even partial health, if you have a spouse or partner nearby, even one you've had minor disagreements with this week, if you have children who, however imperfectly, still call, the Stoics would say this is wealth, actual wealth. Not the deferred wealth of the next acquisition, but the present wealth of what already surrounds you, wealth you've perhaps stopped noticing because you're too busy wanting the next thing. If you've made it this far into the video, I have to say that tells me something about you. You're the kind of person who takes this seriously, who's actually looking for something more than entertainment. So let me ask you directly, hit subscribe if you haven't already, because we release videos exactly like this one every single week. And this channel exists specifically for people exactly like you. Rule 7. Build your inner citadel before the storm arrives. This is the rule I promised you at the beginning, the one almost nobody talks about, and arguably the most important one on this entire list. Here it is. The time to build resilience is before you need it, not during the crisis that requires it. Marcus Aurelius used a specific metaphor for this: the inner citadel. A fortress within the mind, built stone by stone through daily philosophical practice, that remains standing regardless of what storms rage outside its walls: illness, loss, betrayal, political chaos, financial hardship. None of these, he argued, can breach a properly fortified inner citadel, not because the person inside doesn't feel pain, but because their fundamental sense of self and worth doesn't depend on external circumstances remaining favorable. Here's why this matters so specifically for people over 60, and why I consider it the most overlooked rule in this entire framework. The years after 60 statistically contain more significant losses packed closer together than almost any other period of adult life. The death of parents, if they haven't already passed, increasingly the death of friends and even spouses, the decline, gradual or sudden, of your own physical capabilities, retirement itself, which for all its freedoms represents a genuine loss of identity, routine, and daily purpose that many people underestimate until it's already happened. If you wait until the storm arrives to start building your inner resources, you will be building in the rain, in the dark, with the wind already tearing at the walls. This is precisely what happens to people who have spent 60 years focused entirely outward on career, on possessions, on other people's opinions, and never developed the internal practices that provide stability when the outer world inevitably shifts beneath them. The good news is that the inner citadel can be built at any age, and the materials are freely available to anyone willing to do the daily work. Marcus Aurelius himself wrote Meditations not as a philosophical treatise for publication, but as a private journal, a daily practice of examining his own thoughts, checking his own judgments, reminding himself of the principles he wanted to live by before he needed them in an emergency. He wrote these entries not during his worst crises, but as ongoing maintenance, the same way you might do daily physical therapy exercises, not only when your knee already hurts, but especially when it doesn't, to prevent the pain in the first place. What does this look like practically at your stage of life? It looks like a daily habit, even 5 or 10 minutes, of reflection, writing down each morning or evening what went well, what challenged you, and how you responded to that challenge according to your own values rather than your immediate impulses. It looks like regularly revisiting the dichotomy of control from Rule 2, not just when a crisis forces you to, but as ongoing daily maintenance. It looks like cultivating relationships and sources of meaning that don't depend entirely on your health or your income remaining exactly as they are today, because eventually, for every person watching this video, something will change. I think of the difference between two men, both widowers in their 70s, both losing wives they'd been married to for over 4 decades. One man had spent years, quietly and without fanfare, in daily reflective practice, examining his own responses to difficulty, cultivating friendships and interests entirely separate from his marriage. However much he loved his wife, the other had built his entire identity and daily structure around his marriage, and had no comparable inner resources. Both men grieved genuinely deeply as anyone would, but one had a citadel to retreat into during the worst months of his grief, a foundation of daily practice and independent meaning that gave him something to stand on. The other had nothing beneath him at all, and the grief, unbuffered by any inner structure, very nearly broke him entirely. This is Rule 7, and it deserves repeating because of how easily it gets overlooked. Build the fortress before the siege, not during it. Start today with something as small as 5 minutes of honest journaling about how you responded to today's frustrations. The storms of later life are not hypothetical. They are, for every person watching, a matter of when, not if. The only real question is whether you'll have a citadel to retreat into when they arrive. Rule 8. Reciprocal love. Give what you wish you'd received. Marcus Aurelius opens Meditations, remarkably not with grand philosophical proclamations, but with a long list of gratitude, specific people, who shaped his character and what, exactly, he learned from each one. His grandfather taught him good morals and the government of his temper. His mother taught him piety and generosity. A tutor taught him to avoid the factions of the circus and the amphitheater, to endure labor, to want little, and to work with his own hands. This opening reveals something the rest of Meditations builds upon, that a well-lived life is deeply relational, shaped by what you receive from others and, crucially, by what you in turn give. At 60 plus, you occupy a unique, relational position most people don't fully appreciate until they're standing in it themselves. You have decades of accumulated wisdom, hard-won through actual living rather than theory. And simultaneously, you likely have more available time and attention than you've had since childhood to actually offer that wisdom to people who need it. This is a profound and often underutilized opportunity. The Stoics believed strongly in what they called oikeiosis, a natural process of expanding your circle of concern outward, from yourself to your family, to your community, to humanity as a whole. Heracles, a later Stoic, described this using the image of concentric circles and argued that the work of a wise person is to draw those outer circles progressively closer to the center, treating strangers with something approaching the care you'd naturally give your own family, practically at this stage of life. This might mean mentoring a younger colleague or family member, not from a position of superiority but genuine partnership. It might mean volunteering the specific expertise you spent 40 years developing, expertise that would otherwise simply retire along with you into disuse. It might mean, quite simply, becoming the grandparent, the uncle, the neighbor, the friend who shows up consistently for people younger than yourself, offering not money necessarily, but presence, patience, and earned perspective. One retired school teacher we heard from, a woman in her late 60s, described starting a free weekly tutoring program for kids in her neighborhood struggling with reading, kids whose parents worked multiple jobs and couldn't easily provide additional academic support at home. She told us this program gave her a sense of purpose more vivid and immediate than almost anything from her last decade of formal teaching, precisely because it was chosen freely, without the bureaucratic obligations of institutional employment, purely from her own values and her own accumulated skill. There's a deep Stoic logic here worth naming explicitly. Virtue, for the Stoics, was never a private achievement, cultivated in isolation for your own personal peace of mind alone. It was inherently social, meant to be expressed through your relationships and your contribution to the wider human community. A retirement spent purely in self-focused leisure, however pleasant, misses this entire dimension of what the Stoics considered a genuinely excellent human life. So here's a direct question for you, and I'd genuinely love to read your answer in the comments. What is one specific piece of hard-won wisdom or skill you've accumulated over your working life that you could offer this month to someone younger who needs exactly what you have to give? Don't overthink it. Name one thing and consider, seriously, how you might offer it in the coming weeks. Rule 9. The proper use of time. Treat each day like the precious resource it actually is. We return, in a sense, to where we began, but with a sharper, practical edge. Seneca's essay on the shortness of life contains one of the most quietly devastating observations in all of Stoic literature. He points out that people are famously careful, even miserly, with their money, guarding it, budgeting it, refusing to lend it out carelessly. Yet those same careful people will squander their time, the one truly irreplaceable resource, with a carelessness they would never permit with their finances. People are frugal in guarding their personal property, Seneca wrote. But as soon as it comes to squandering time, they are most wasteful of the one thing in which it is right to be stingy. This observation carries specific and urgent weight after 60. When you were 30, wasting an afternoon felt inconsequential, a drop in an ocean of decades still ahead. At 65 or 70, the ocean is smaller, and every drop carries more relative weight. And yet, paradoxically, this is often precisely the period when people report losing entire days, even weeks, to passive activities they can barely remember afterward. Hours of undirected television, endless scrolling, naps taken not from genuine restorative need, but from a lack of anything more compelling pulling them toward wakefulness. The Stoics were not opposed to rest. Seneca explicitly praised leisure, but a specific kind of leisure, what he called otium, meaning reflective, purposeful leisure spent in reading, in contemplation, in genuine engagement with ideas and people, as opposed to what he dismissively called mere idleness. Time spent doing essentially nothing that leaves you, at the end of it, no wiser and no more fulfilled than when you began. Here's a practical distinction worth adopting immediately. Before an activity, ask yourself honestly whether it constitutes genuine restoration, a walk that clears your mind, a conversation with a loved one, a book that expands your thinking, a hobby that engages your hands and your attention, or whether it's simply a filler a way of making unstructured time disappear without actually inhabiting it. This isn't about turning retirement into another regimented job with a rigid schedule of mandatory self-improvement. That would betray the entire spirit of Stoic philosophy, which values freedom and rational choice over external compulsion. It's about bringing conscious intention to a resource, your remaining days, that is, without exception, the most finite and non-renewable resource any human being possesses. I think about an 81-year-old man, still an active viewer of this very channel, who wrote to us describing his morning ritual, waking at the same time each day, regardless of whether he has anywhere to be, making coffee deliberately and without rushing, reading for 30 minutes from whatever philosophical text currently interests him, and then, only after this, checking his phone for the first time. He described this not as a rigid discipline imposed on himself, but as a daily act of respect toward a day he understands he will not get back, one of a genuinely countable and diminishing number remaining to him. This is Rule 9. Audit your days not with anxiety, but with the same careful attention you'd give your finances. Where is your time actually going? And does that destination reflect what you claim to value, or has it simply drifted there through the path of least resistance? Rule 10. Die complete, live so that the end, whenever it comes, finds nothing left unsaid. We end where perhaps the entire philosophy of Stoicism ultimately points toward a good death, which the Stoics understood not as a morbid preoccupation, but as the natural and necessary companion of a good life. You cannot fully understand how to live, they argued, without also making peace with how you will eventually stop living. Marcus Aurelius wrote that we should perform every act of our life as if it were the last, free from carelessness, free from the numbing distraction that prevents us from actually inhabiting our own experience. This was not a call to constant anxious urgency, but rather an invitation to a specific kind of presence and completeness, to leave nothing important unsaid, no important reconciliation unattempted, no meaningful action perpetually postponed to a tomorrow that, at this stage of life especially, is never fully guaranteed. The word the Greeks and Romans used in relation to this idea is worth knowing. Euthanasia, in its original and far less clinical sense, simply meant a good death, not necessarily an easy or painless one, but a complete one. A death that arrives after a life fully lived, fully examined, with no vital business left pending. What would it mean, practically, for you to die complete? It likely doesn't mean achieving every ambition you ever held. Most lives, even long and full ones, leave some ambitions unrealized. And the Stoics would tell you this is simply the nature of finite existence, and nothing to mourn excessively. But it does mean something more specific and more achievable. No unspoken words of love left unspoken. No estrangement left unaddressed that could still, with effort and humility, be repaired. No talent or capacity left entirely unused out of fear or procrastination, when opportunities to use it, even modestly, still remained available. This is, in the end, the entire argument of this video, distilled into its final and most urgent form. The 9 rules before this one are, in many ways, in service of this 10th and final rule. Accepting mortality, releasing what you cannot control, embracing your actual circumstances rather than resenting them, gaining proportion on your problems, living according to your own values rather than an audience's approval, disciplining your desires, building your inner citadel, giving generously of your accumulated wisdom, and treating your remaining days as the precious resource they are. All of this, together, is how you arrive at the end of your life, whenever that end comes, with the profound and rare peace of having lived complete. I want to leave you with a final image, one drawn directly from Stoic thought. Imagine your life as a play, and imagine that the length of the play, whether it runs 3 acts or 5, whether it's cut short unexpectedly or runs to its full and expected conclusion, is not actually up to you. What is up to you, entirely and completely, is how well you play whatever role and however many acts you're given. Epictetus said exactly this. It is not up to you whether the play is long or short, but it is entirely up to you to play it well. You have already lived the first acts of your play. Whatever mistakes were made in those earlier acts, whatever regrets have quietly accumulated, they belong to the acts already performed and cannot be rewritten now. But the acts still ahead of you, however many remain, and none of us know the true number. Those acts are still entirely yours to write and to perform with whatever combination of courage, honesty, generosity, and presence you choose to bring to them. So there they are. 10 Stoic rules for a retirement lived without regret. Remember your mortality and let it clarify rather than terrify. Release your grip on what was never yours to control. Love your actual circumstances rather than the fantasy ones you didn't get. Gain proportion through the view from above. Live according to your own values rather than a vanished audience. Discipline your desires and notice the wealth already surrounding you. Build your inner citadel before the storm, not during it. Give generously of what you've earned through decades of hard-won experience. Treat your remaining days like the finite, precious resource they actually are. And live each day so that whenever the final curtain falls, it finds you complete. None of this requires perfect execution. The Stoics themselves were quite clear that they were describing an ideal, a direction to walk toward, not a destination any human being fully and permanently reaches. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome with access to every philosophical resource of his age, still wrote to himself daily, still struggled, still fell short and picked himself back up, entry after entry, for years. That struggle, honestly engaged with, is itself the practice. There is no arriving, there is only the daily, humble return to these principles again and again, for however many days remain to you. If this video gave you something to genuinely sit with today, I'd ask you to do 3 small things. First, share it with someone in your life who's approaching this exact stage. A sibling, a friend, a spouse. Because this message tends to land differently depending on when someone hears it, and you might be giving them exactly what they need at exactly the right moment. Second, subscribe to Wisdom of the Stoics if you haven't already, because we publish content exactly like this every single week, built for people who take the art of living seriously. And third, tell me in the comments below which of these 10 rules you most need to practice. Starting today. I read every comment, and I would genuinely love to know which one landed hardest for you. Until next time, remember, you don't get to choose how long your play runs, but you, and only you, get to choose how well you play it.